to take just a moment to talk to you about the second sermon that we'll be looking at this Sunday in Acts chapter 1. As you know, we're in a series about Peter, reckless, wrecked, and radical. And we're beginning to understand how he was going to live a life that was radical for the Lord. And one of the key elements that we're learning in Acts chapter 1 is that he learned obedience. And he was applying patience. And the Lord said, do this. And he was doing it where before he was not. And so this is a key for us as well. We must learn obedience. Let me give you 3 keys to learning obedience in the Christian life. Here they are. Number 1, know what you believe. Secondly, know why you believe it. And thirdly, know that you will obey it. This is very key. You can't obey God unless you really know why you're doing this, what it is you're supposed to do, and knowing that you will do it. This is absolutely key. I think it defines what it means to own your own faith. You must own your own faith. You can't live off what somebody else believes. You've got to go to God's Word. You've got to let Him speak to you. And you've got to determine, here's what I believe about God. Here's why I believe it. And I know that I will obey it. Those are the keys. Now, there's a couple of factors that I want to note that keep us from obeying God's Word. One is, if we never open God's Word, if we never open the Bible, how in the world are we going to know what God's heart is? How are we going to let Him reveal to us how we're supposed to live? How are we ever going to know His great love for us? We can't, and we won't if we don't open His Word. Secondly, when we do open it, we must be willing to obey it. See, one of the great things Peter struggled with over in the Gospels is simply this. He heard what God's will was, and he disagreed with it. He said, I hear what you're saying, but I've got a better plan. We can't do that. If God reveals truth to us, we've got to be willing to obey it. You know, it's interesting to me when we talk about knowing God's will. I read these comments this morning. It was a survey that was taken among American believers, and here are the statistics that they came up with. Let me read a few of those to you right now. In this survey with Americans about their knowledge of the Bible, here's what they learned, is that most participants could name all 4 of the Beatles, but they could not name one of the 10 Commandments. And how about this? 1 in 10 people thought Moses was one of Jesus' disciples. Also, 12% of American adults thought Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. And then lastly, 50% of graduating high school seniors thought Sodom and Gomorrah were husband and wife. Now, if any of those stats are true of us, it simply means this. We've not opened God's Word enough to know God's heart. And we've got to open His Word. We've got to know His Word if we're going to obey His Word. And once He makes His heart clear to us, His will clear to us, the things that are best clear to us, then we've got to choose to obey it. I want to leave you with this verse about obedience. It comes out of 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22. King Saul had rationalized in his mind that he had obeyed God fully, but really he knew he had not. And you can read the chapter to understand that. But Samuel confronts him, and here's what Samuel says to him, and we should take this to heart. It says in verse 22, but Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to hear the voice of God, and I want to obey it. That's worth taking the time to do. Peter learned to apply patience, hear from God, obey Him is the foundation and the basis to living a life that is radical. Acts chapter 1, we see Peter doing this. And in the chapters to come, we see Peter living a life radical for the Lord. As God does through him what he cannot do himself, the power of God upon him, as he proclaims the resurrected Lord with consistency for God's glory. We've got to learn the same. So I look forward to sharing these truths with you about obedience and listening to God this Sunday. So prepare your heart and let's do great things for God.